Well, good afternoon. We'll start here in Washington. Uh, my name is Paulo Sotero. I'm the director of the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center. It is a pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon to talk about a very difficult moment in Brazil. Brazil, after the downgrading, a crisis that is deepening as we speak, and to which we see no ending right now. I will just now present our speakers. They are four people that are great friends of the Institute. Starting here with me, Mauricio Moura, an economist, a pollster, who has worked both as an analyst and working in political campaigns in Brazil and in other countries. And he is here particularly to present a poll that he ran thinking about this event, a discussion on public opinion facing this crisis in Brazil. We have in São Paulo, speaking from the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Institute, which is the closest of a presidential library we have in Brazil. In downtown São Paulo, Sérgio Fausto, who is the executive director of the Cardoso Institute, a sociologist who publishes widely and is a very important participant in the debate of public policies in Brazil. With Sergio, we have Claudio Couto, who is a political scientist, professor at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, one of the most prestigious schools in Brazil. Claudio is, well, he will clarify that if I'm wrong, but Claudio is normally identified in Brazil as a political analyst closer to the Workers' Party. We have also, in order to keep this plural and diverse, we have also another dear friend, Eduardo Gianetti, an economist, professor of INSPER, also a prestigious business school in Brazil, author, and who has politically been very close to former senator, former minister of the environment, former presidential candidate Marina Silva. So we have, I think, a good spectrum of opinions. I will not, go too much in details about the nature of the crisis. We believe that its expression may be economic, but is mostly a political crisis in Brazil. And but that's what we are going to talk about, actually, to identify what are we facing. We know that this is very serious, and we know that the economic side of the crisis is much more serious than the two crises we faced in the recent years, like in '99, under President Cardoso, in the transition from Cardoso to President Lula in 2002 to 2003. This is a different animal. Brazil, some people have described the situation as the Brazilian government having bankrupted the state. This is, the debate has been very, very intense, and we will continue it here today. During this, people will be filming because we are collecting some images for future use, so you will be seeing cameramen around. But I would like to start then after this brief introduction by inviting Mauricio Moura to start his presentation on the economic and political context of the current crisis. Mauricio, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Professors Sergio, Eduardo, and Claudio. Thank you, Paulo, for the invitation. I'm pleased to be here to participate in this discussion today. Actually, and I'm eager to hear Professor Sergio, Eduardo, and Claudio talk about the current situation. Professor Eduardo, a long time ago, was my professor in History of Economic Thought, University of São Paulo. It was actually an evening class, and it was a very crowded evening class. So it's an honor to be here today. In order to bring some food for thought for the discussion, we ran a survey from September 10 to September 14. And we called, it was a telephone survey, we called around 20,000 people all over Brazil, around 143 cities. It was actually a short survey. We just asked 6 questions, and they basically addressed, first of all, the Dilma's government, the current evaluation about the Dilma's government as of today. We tried to measure and get some public opinion perceptions about how people see the Lava Jato, the car wash, the scandal investigation, and the consequence for the economy. And also try to get some flavor about the possibilities of impeachment or resignation. So we'll just try to tackle those perceptions. First of all, talking about the evaluation itself. It's 71% of the people today in Brazil claim that they do not approve the current administration. On the other side, only 7% say that they approve. So there is some people that doesn't have those extreme evaluations, but this is very high. Actually, it's the worst presidential evaluation since the return of democracy, and it's in line with different surveys with different methods that are being run in Brazil right now. And on that, I want to highlight an important point about why Dilma has reached such low evaluation, such low popularity. I think one of the issues that we see doing surveys and doing polling in Brazil this moment is that the economic situation, the economic component is very strong. What I see that maybe Professor Eduardo can correct me, but I think we are losing about 100,000 jobs per month in Brazil. So there is a lot of unemployment stories when you talk to people, when we interview people. And there's a lot of fear that people are losing jobs, are going to be losing jobs. So, and that connects directly with presidential popularity. There's a lot of studies that show that presidentials are evaluated with the state of the economy. So one of the things that we see polling is that this has a lot to do with the current recession that we're living. If I'm not mistaken, this is the 5th cycle of recession after the Rio Plan, after 1994. But one thing that I feel, interviewing, talking to people, is that the new aspect is that people don't see the end of the road, or people don't see an exit of those situations, or people are kind of hopeless about when we are going to go out in that situation. So that reflects clearly in the government evaluation. The second part, in July, President Dilma said, I'm gonna read to be fair with her. She said, "The negative effects of car wash operation brought the GDP down by 1 point." She said that one of the meetings with her ministers. To be fair, I haven't seen any econometric or economic model that connects the car wash, the investigations with the state of the economy. But we try to ask people how do they feel about it. Né? So we ask them, please give your opinion about the following sentence. The Lava Jato, or the car wash investigation, the corruption scandal investigation, is one of the main reasons why the Brazilian economy is not doing well in 2015. And the overall answers were in the opposite side. So people do not agree that there is a direct link between the Lava Jato and the state of the economy. But let's suppose, the third question that we asked, so let's suppose this is true. So we're going to have negative effects on the economy given the continuity of the investigation. So we asked, please give your opinion about the following. The Lava Jato investigation should continue despite any negative effect on the economy. Again, people strongly disagree. Sorry, people agree with that. So, and this was kind of a very surprising result, and a very good result in my opinion, because that means that there is a public opinion support to the investigations, even under the scenario that we will bring more economic instability and more political uncertainty. So that's a very interesting interesting outcome on that side. And so we have three aspects here. We have low popularity, we have economic crisis, and we have the political crisis. And that, in my opinion, that translates into a loss of confidence in the country and in the government itself. So we asked, in your opinion, President Dilma Rousseff will, and 64% said will not complete her term as a president. And here we're not talking yet about impeachment or resignation, just asking if she's going to be able to complete. One of the things that I felt, so people have started to realize that this government, as it is today, it's kind of over in terms of political ability to lead. And that's, I have seen many surveys and many polls that
Just one thing for those who are not following this, President Rousseff started her second term in January, so there are 3.5 years to go in her second term.
So let's assume President Dilma governability is weak and is fragile as people are feeling in this survey. I think, and we have the specialists here to correct me, I think we have three scenarios. The first one is that she stays in power, but she's going to be staying in power with a very low popularity. And that, in my opinion, we're going to have a huge opportunity cost for the Brazilian in a whole. And people, some specialists say that's going to be like a Sarney style during 3 years. So this is the first scenario.
Again, Sarney is a former president of Brazil who governed the first president after the democratic transition. He was not elected. He was a vice president, replaced an indirect elected president who died very sick and died soon after. So it was a very complicated period in Brazil.
And that brings us to the next question. We ask it only for those who think she will not complete her second term as a president. How will she leave the office? What are the, and then comes to the second possibility. The 35% of those that think she will leave the office think it should be by impeachment process. And I'm gonna go back to the impeachment very soon. And then 60% think that she will resign. And I wanna make some comments about Dilma resigning. First of all, she mentioned like a couple weeks ago the following from Dilma's words. I have resisted a lot during my life, including prison and torture. I'm capable to resist any kind of pressure. So giving her personal record and maybe his psychological profile, some claim that's very unlikely that she will resign. So that's one side. On the other hand, I heard that she's above all an activist. And for an activist like Dilma, the cause is above any personal issue. So if she feels that's she's gonna kind of will diminish the legacy of the work party or the legacy of Lula, there's a window for her to resign. So that's what some two sides of the same issue. And the last question: do you support an impeachment as of today at the moment? And there is 63% that say they support impeachment, and that's in line with another survey that Datafolha did, not telephone survey. Datafolha did a personal survey, and 63.
No, 61.
Oh, so sorry, 61, 61. 61%. Datafolha was 63, if I'm not mistaken. So, and I want to talk about, of course, no, there is no impeachment that should be triggered by public opinion, but there is the impeachment itself today. It's different from former President Collor that was in the middle of the impeachment process in 1992. And basically, because there is no, at the moment, there is no legal basis for impeachment, and especially compared to Collor, there is no direct link between corruption and the president itself. So the impeachment, in my opinion, the impeachment is a long road for, in terms legally speaking, politically speaking, it's going to be difficult for the government to resist the impeachment process, but it's going to be even more difficult for the opposition, whoever you think the opposition is in Brazil, because sometimes it's hard to identify who is the opposition in that sense. And so the impeachment is a very complicated process. So that's my contribution.
Just on that, before I give the floor to our colleagues in São Paulo, is that there are 4 requests by opposition party, I believe the PSDB, to the Superior Electoral Tribunal that could, if accepted, serve as a basis, eventually, it's not clear, of an impeachment process. It could be presented as a cause for impeachment, debatable. There is also an action at the Accounting Tribunal of the Union, which is sort of the GAO equivalent, that relates to management of government accounts. Last year, all indications are that the tribunal will reject the government's account. It's an auditing entity that also could, under certain circumstances, be construed as a cause for impeachment. But this is, in both cases, it's a political process. So this is not exact science. Well, with that, I would like to offer the floor to our dear friends in São Paulo, starting with Sergio Fausto. Sergio, go ahead.
All right. Paulo, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for being there. I plan to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes maximum. My idea is to present schematically how I see things in Brazil now, so that we can have time to a more informal interaction and Q&A here. I will start by pointing out to an analysis that was released recently by Eurasia Group on Brazil, authored by João Castro Neves, I think 3 days ago. And if you haven't read it yet, I recommend you that you do that, because it's really a well-articulated, well-thought, thorough analysis about the Brazilian economic and political situation, and how the political and the economic components of the crisis interact. The basic conclusion of Castro Neves' analysis says that we are dealing with two scenarios. One in which Dilma Rousseff manages to muddle through the situation and serves out her second term in office, and he attributes a 60% likelihood that this scenario prevails. And the other one is that either through impeachment or through resignation, Dilma will not serve out to the end of her term in office. I subscribe to the rationale behind these two scenarios, but I would argue that, in my view, my guess is that the percentages should be attributed the other way around. So, in a nutshell, I see the scenario in which Dilma does not serve out her term in office is more likely than the one in which she manages to muddle through to the very end, to 2018. And the reasons why I would argue that this scenario is more likely than the other one is that at least 3 out of 4 conditions to a termination of her mandate have already been met, namely extremely low popularity rates. We're really at a record low level of popularity rates ever in Brazil. Second, virtually she has no longer control over Congress and over the agenda setting process. Yes, her base of support in Congress is shrinking by the day. It's extremely unstable, as the incentives to support the government are really in a nose-diving trajectory. And this is the incentives are diminishing drastically to support the government, because I think the government is trapped in a political and economic vicious circle, right? And I see no reason to believe that the government has what it takes to regain the ability to regain terrain and to recoup the minimum amount of credibility to deal with the economic crisis and to offer a more constructive and hopeful perspective for society as a whole. So 3 of the 4 conditions for a termination of her mandate have already been met. The question is, will the 4th condition be met? And the 4th condition is, let's say, juridical grounds to opening up the impeachment process. In this regard, I would like to call attention to let's say, 3 tipping points that are sort of embedded in the conjuncture. Paulo Sotero has already mentioned them. The National Accounting Court will be releasing a final judgment, passing a final judgment on her accounts in the following weeks, maybe next week. And as far as we can predict, it seems likely that the account of Dilma will be rejected. This can really pull the trigger for the impeachment process in the lower house. In addition to that, there is those pending issues being examined at the electoral Supreme Court, and evidences are accumulating in the direction that there have been abuses of economic power, as we say here, in the election that led to Dilma's 2nd term in office. It's important to emphasize in this respect that just 2 days ago, the court gave a green light for the investigation on these accusations of economic abuse of political power to advance, to go on, right? So there's no paucity of tipping points in the conjuncture and triggers to really to ignite some sort of juridical procedure that will end up indetermination of her mandate in office. It's important also to call attention to the fact that we have a new round of fiscal adjustment measures just presented before Congress. And it's really hard to believe that the Congress will approve the package as it has been presented by government. And worse than that, even in the case of the approval of this economic package, it's hard to believe that this will be enough to instill credibility in society and in the markets. So it's not only not likely that the package will be approved, but also it's too little and too late. Just to conclude, taking into consideration that an impeachment process is not it's not a simple thing, right? Taking into consideration that Dilma still have, because of the fact that he is linked to the Workers' Party, she still has some support base in society and in Congress. It's fair to say that it will not be as easy as it was to remove her from office compared to the process that took place in 1992 with Collor de Mello. So my basic scenario is one that leads to a protected in crisis, that things will go from bad to worse, and at the end of the day, at some point next year, she will be forced to resign. Right? And I'll stop here so that we have time to for my colleagues to speak, and then to a formal conversation between us.
Thank you, Sergio. I would like, Claudio, would you go next, please?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Paulo. If you allow me just a little repair, I would say that I don't identify myself especially as a political analyst that is closer to the political part. Certainly I'm closer than Sergio is. But even though I wouldn't define myself as exactly a partisan of the Workers' Party or someone who have links with that. If I consider the demonstrators as an indicator that I'm not in each of the demonstrations, not against the government, not in favor of the government. I would like to talk about this current crisis, dividing that into 5 different aspects. And I would say that perhaps for more clarity that we have perhaps 5 different crises. One of them is an economic crisis. I don't have to say a lot about that. I think that Eduardo has more words than me to explain that. But perhaps the apex of this crisis was the recent downgrading of Brazil, and it explains a lot about that. But the second dimension of this crisis, or the second crisis if you prefer, is a coalition crisis. And I think that this is perhaps one of the most important aspects of the current crisis that have Brazil. And why that? Because the government, to tackle the economic crisis that the country suffers currently, it has to implement an important political and economic adjustment in the Congress. Not only for more immediate measures, but also infrastructure measures, like measures that have to do with problems concerning the pension system. Mostly now, the private sector pension system that presents an increasing deficit in its accounts. But what we see in the Congress is exactly the opposite situation. And why that? Because the government has lost, since the middle of the last term, of the first term of Dilma Rousseff, political support in the Congress. When we consider the pattern of the roll calls votes in the Congress, what we can see is that we have a more and more dispersed pattern of roll call votes in favor or against the government in the Congress. It means that the government relied more and more on the opposition votes in the end of the first term. It means that it was necessary for the government to make concessions to the opposition to obtain their support because the government was already losing the votes that it used to obtain with the parties of the governmental coalition. Not especially the PT and other parties of the left, but all of that adhesion parties that provide support to government in the center of the partisan system. And since she lost the support, it was necessary to obtain support from the opposition. But when we consider the pattern of roll call votes during the first semester of this year, what we can see is that the president lost support from all the parties, not only the opposition, that is, the concessions are not enough anymore, but even the votes that used to come in the recent months from the adhesion parties. A considerable part of the parties that have ministers, that have positions in the government, that provided support for Dilma Rousseff's government, for Lula's administration, and even for Fernando Henrique Cardoso's administration before that, part that provides support to any government, it doesn't matter which. These parties don't vote with the government as they used to do before, at least if you consider the cohesion of this party. And this is why it's so difficult for the president to implement the agenda, to carry on this agenda, but also why some measures go against the agenda. They are not only the measures that she needs, but the measures that she needs to not have approved in Congress, and they are. Like, for example, the extinguishing of the previdentiary factor, the calculus that makes people, that create incentives for people to retire later. And this is an example of an important decision in the Congress that goes against what the government needs now. And so the coalition administration, the coalition management was lost. The president is not able to do that. Her main ADs are not able to do that. And we have this corrosion of her political support in the Congress. This is the second dimension. The third dimension of the crisis is a legitimacy and moral crisis. And of course, it has to do with problems of corruption. Historically, when you consider the usual support that Brazilians provide to parties, to the Congress, to the political class, to political institutions in general, we have very low levels of political support. We can see that in different polls that were performed in different moments. But in this regard, the Brazilian situation is not so different from the situation that we have seen in other moments or in other countries. When we compare Brazil to southern European countries, we have a similar situation in terms of support that is provided both for parties and for the parliament in the case of European countries. And so Brazil is not exactly an outlier in that regard. But when we consider the support that is provided for the government itself, that is to the executive branch, we see a very different situation. A situation in which the levels of support are historically very, very low, as was mentioned by the two presentators that talked before me. Well, and it has to do with several factors, with the economic crisis, but also with a factor that is peculiar to the current crisis, that is corruption. That is the perception that corruption corrodes the grounds of the government, corrodes the basis of the government. And so people don't recognize this government as a legitimate government anymore. Not only the president, but the government itself. And first, and with this I can talk about the third dimension of this crisis, the party, the main party of the government, the Workers' Party, the PT. The party lost its political support. Again, the polls show that. And why the polls show that? Because when we compare the level of support, of partisan support that PT obtained nowadays, it's much lower than the support that the party used to receive in recent years or during its history. And PT was transformed during Lula's years as the most supported party in Brazil. And now it's not anymore, what is surprising. We can say that the brand of the party that was so important to create a reputation, now it was important to disconstruct the party reputation, not only because the party faced problems of corruption, of course this is the main problem, but also because the reaction of the party in face of these problems of corruption was an Olympic reaction. The party reacted as it has nothing to do with that. Olympic, I said. That is, the party says, well, I have nothing to do with this. This is a problem of the media. This is a problem of the opposition. This is a creation of the elites against the Workers' Party, and this is not true anymore. When people raise their hands, when they go arrested, it's a symbol of that. A symbol that I don't care. And when you have the repetition of that, and the same guys that had problems with the justice before, they have problems with justice again. When you have this for the second time, the treasurer of the party being arrested for problems of bribing, well, it's too much. And so this is why you can say that we have not only a coalition crisis, but specifically a crisis of the party of the government. But I would say that we have in a lower dimension also, if it's not exactly a crisis, problems of coordination in the main opposition party, I mean the PSDB. And why that? Because the main leaders of the party don't agree between themselves about what is the strategy for them. On one hand, we have the former presidential candidate, Aécio Neves, for whom it would be interesting to have the impeachment of both the president and the vice president right now, for having elections before 2 years. If you consider the purpose of the eternal candidate of the party, José Serra, and of the current incumbent governor of São Paulo, Geraldo Alckmin, for these guys, it would be better to have elections in 2016. And so, not the impeachment or the resignation of both guys right now, but something after 2 years. And so, this is why I have different speaks about what would be adequate, about what would be necessary right now. And so, this is why I think that we don't have exactly a crisis like in the case of the T, but we have problems of strategy, of a unified strategy. And finally, I would say that economic, coalition, party, legitimacy, and finally the last, and for me, at this moment, the most important crisis, a crisis of leadership. And it has to do with the incumbent president. Because the incumbent president, as Mauricio already said, she's a very complex personality. As he mentioned, she said some days ago that for one who was tortured, who was arrested, such a kind of pressures that we have right now is not exactly something that will force her to resign. And so it creates a situation of a gridlock. We don't know exactly what can be done because we don't have yet the juridical conditions that would make likely the process of impeachment. We don't have the legal ground for that. But on the other hand, it's very unlikely that the president will resign by herself, except as, again, I have, sorry to repeat what Maurice said, because this was my point too, except if she sees a resignation as an act of courage, as an act of political honor, something that goes in favor of her political convictions. And she's a very convicted person. I will define the president not exactly as a politician, and this is an important point for me. The president is not a typical politician. I would say the president is a hybrid of both a militant and a bureaucrat. A militant, comparing to a politician, because different from a politician who looks for solutions of compromise for her actions. She doesn't compromise. She has convictions, and what she wants to do is to implement them convictions. This is why she's so voluntaristic, both in the economic area and the former economic policy as an example of that, and also in terms of her political relationship with the parties of the coalition. And so it makes things really difficult to be implemented. And she's a bureaucrat, and I think that it has to do with her former experience, both in the public administration and even during her political action as an activist during the guerrilla, when she was a bookkeeper. She wasn't exactly a leader of the guerrilla. She was the bookkeeper of the guerrilla. She did the accounts of that. And we would say that in some regards she remains the same. She still is in the guerrilla, not because she's a radical in the ideological terms. She's not a radical anymore, you see that, but because she still is the bureaucrat that she used to be. And we've said, yeah.
Okay, I wanted to kind of
I just want to may I just conclude?
Yes.
Okay, and I would finish just saying the following, sorry for the time. I would say that this hybrid of a bureaucrat and a militant becomes even more complicated with this pattern of the president as someone who concentrates decisions on herself, on her table, that is incapable of delegating tasks for their ADs, for the people who work on that. Just to finish, and this is my final word, I promise, I would say that as a friend of mine who is, this guy exactly a member of the government, a member of the party, of the political party, when I asked him how he would describe her, and he told me the following thing, that I think that summarizes Dilma Rousseff's personality. He says, well, you know, we have those two kinds of people who look at the forest and people who look at the tree. She's neither of that. She's a person who looks at the leaves. And this is a problem in such situations like this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And she doesn't see them clearly.
Thank you very much, Claudio. Eduardo, please, could you wrap us up here with your comments? Go ahead.
Hello, Paulo. Hello, Mauricio. It's a great pleasure to join this discussion group. First of all, I'd like to say that Mauricio, Sergio, and Claudio have made very competent, somewhat detailed analysis of the political situation in Brazil. I guess my hope here will be more to elaborate on the economic dimension of the crisis, okay? And I'd like to bring a broader perspective as well, not so much the day-to-day problems of Brazil, but what's underlying the situation we are facing now. As a first approximation, I would say that Brazil is confronted with a very peculiar combination of economic and political crisis. And there's a positive feedback between them. The economic weakness of the country feeds the political weakness of the incumbent government. We have a recession, which is the worst recession by large since the stabilization plan. We have inflation high. It's going to be something between 9 and 10% in the year of 2015. And we have fear among the ordinary people. Brazil is losing, as Mauricio said correctly, Brazil is losing something like 100,000 formal jobs monthly since the beginning of the year. So people are really fearful and people are angry because they work with a high expectation about the future. And no wonder the popularity of the president is so low. On the other hand, the political weakness of the government feeds the economic incapacity to solve and to adjust the economy. Joaquim Levy was summoned for the Ministry of Finance in order to make a fiscal adjustment. His proposal was to produce a primary surplus this year in the fiscal balance of 1.2% of GDP. Next year, the proposal originally was 2% of GDP. Well, he's going to deliver a deficit, a primary deficit, probably, in the primary surplus this year, perhaps even worse than last year, because receipts are very low due to the recession. And the government made a terrible mess about the budget for next year. First, they floated the idea of introducing a new tax on the financial transactions. Then they backtracked. Then they submitted to Congress a budget with a primary deficit for next year, resulted in the downgrade of Brazil by Standard & Poor's last week. And so apparently they don't know exactly what they want to do, because Joaquim Levy hasn't had any chance to implement the fiscal adjustment and to prevent the downgrade that Brazil was menacing Brazil since last year. Now, I think it's necessary to put all this in a broader, in longer term perspective. I think we are facing the end of two cycles in Brazil. The first one is the cycle of fiscal expansion that began with the 1988 Constitution. This is very important, this is very structural. In 1988, on the eve of the new Constitution, the overall tax burden in Brazil was 24% of GDP. Now, it is 36% of GDP. Brazil tax burden in '88 was typical for a middle-income country. Now it's way above what it should be. It's far too high. 36% of GDP as an overall tax burden is far too high for Brazil. On the top of this, there is a nominal deficit of the fiscal balance this year that's going to be 8% of GDP. It's the highest nominal deficit since the beginning of the stability, monetary stability in Brazil. So overall, if you add the overall tax burden with the nominal deficit, you have a country in which 45% of national income goes through the public sector, is intermediated by the public sector. And we don't have even elementary public services that would justify such a huge draining of resources from the private sector to the public sector. We don't have, half of the population doesn't have elementary services of sewage. Elementary education is very poor. Health is a nightmare for most of the Brazilian people, public health. So there's something deeply wrong in public finance of Brazil. This situation was worsening, slow motion. But in the first term of Dilma, it was like someone pressed the fast forward button and the thing really went fast. So now we have a critical situation in the fiscal position of Brazil with a threat of insolvency of the Brazilian government, because overall indebtedness of the government is an unsustainable track. And if it continues like this, it's going to be tricky for Brazil in terms of honoring, from the Brazilian government honoring its obligations. Now, the second crisis, and this is my last point, I think we are seeing the end of a system of government that was based on what we call in Brazil the coalitional presidential system, a system whereby the executive branch would distribute sections of power and state enterprises for potential allies in order to create a base of sustainability for governance. And this system has been deteriorating. I think the mensalão crisis, the corruption crisis that occurred in the first term of Lula was already an indication of how run down this model of governance was already in Brazil. But now it's completely failed. Dilma, in the beginning of her second mandate, distributed ministries. We have 39 ministries in Brazil, amongst more than 10 parties. And she's unable, after having given all these power positions to many parties, she's unable to control her own base of support in Congress. So I think that ultimately it's a crisis of representation. The Brazilian people don't see itself represented in the current legislative and in the current executive. And this is why we have had major mass demonstrations since 2013, and I think that's the underlying problem facing the Brazilian political system. Just to sum up my 2 points, the fiscal time bomb has exploded. The system created by the 1988 Constitution is over, and politically, the presidential coalition, the coalitional presidential system is also bankrupt, and we'll have to find new ways to make democracy work in Brazil. So that's basically what I want to say initially.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. I would like to just to say one thing that I think is important for the audience here and those watching this online. What Claudio mentioned, and I think Eduardo also underlined, which is this crisis of legitimacy. Remember one thing, when the Workers' Party came into existence in 1980, it was the party base that built from the bottom up in a society where everything historically has been built from the top down. It was the party of ethics. It brought ethics to Brazilian politics. And so I say this to you in order for you to measure the disillusion that there is in Brazil, because that party is today with its coalition partners and others involved in what is described, when we talk about Lava Jato, this is a federal criminal investigation on the Petrobras scandal that involves, from what we know now, the theft of some at least $3 billion. It's probably the highest, the largest corruption scandal in history, in any country. This is enormous. This involves companies, bureaucrats, politicians. What I find, and I am on the glass half full school, what I find absolutely fascinating is what Mauricio told us in this poll, the finding that Brazilians are saying that even if Lava Jato, this investigation, produces hardship, economic hardship, it has to go on. So it looks like that there is a certain qualitative change in Brazilian society that underlines all this debate, and the prosecutors, especially the younger generation of prosecutors and judges in Brazil, probably know, understand that they have, the people has their back, that they are supported, they should move ahead, and I think the rest of the political community and the Supreme Court, the more traditional actors in Brazil also sense that. With that, I would like to offer the microphone. Wait until the microphone gets to you so you can ask a question. Like Meg will start our conversation. I would like you to identify yourself for the benefit of our speakers in Brazil.
Thank you, Paolo. I'm Meg Lunsager. I'm a public policy fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Institute, and I was at the IMF for many years as the U.S. Executive Director. So my question is, looking a bit ahead, what you've left us with is a very depressing set of scenarios that it looks like it'll be quite a while to even get to a point where people start having a sense that the political dysfunction will be on a path to being resolved. Not even being resolved, but on a path to being resolved. So my question for you is, how on earth is Brazil going to build the domestic consensus needed to address the economic problems? I mean, your point about how revenues are now a much higher % of GDP, but there's very little to show for it in terms of services for the public. How are you then going to have massive fiscal adjustment that's probably going to bring more pain and take even longer to get some of those results and build back the consensus for economic reforms, even if you can get to the point where you're rebuilding the political, the overall political comfort of the country?
Eduardo, would you like to go first?
Well, I think this will. I'd like to say two things. First, I think Brazil has shown institutional maturity, and I agree with Paulo's point. The judiciary power in Brazil is doing its job as it has never done in Brazilian history. It started with the corruption scandal during Lula government, the so-called mensalão, and now it's the second time the judiciary in Brazil is showing enormous autonomy to really pursue justice and to bring those who committed crimes to punishment. So I think this shows maturity. And this is one of the strong elements that gives me hope about Brazil. I think we've moved ahead in terms of bringing out things that have been done in Brazil for a long time, we were not aware of. Now they are coming out and they're being punished. I think this is very positive. Going back to the question that was just made, I think it will require leadership. And this is a worrying thing about Brazil, the lack of leadership that will be able to really mobilize discontent and coordinate discontent with a new vision of what Brazil needs to put its house in order. I think that the underlying problem of the fiscal that was mentioned, the fiscal problem, the fiscal crisis of Brazil, is that the 1988 Constitution created something I call truncated federalism. It's an ill-defined system of government in which the receipts, public receipts, revenues, go all the way to Brazil, and then they are distributed back to lower levels of government. And we have added layers of government that don't have anything to show in terms of benefits for the ordinary people. I think that this leadership will have to solve for good this ill-defined truncated federalism by decentralizing the authority to tax and the responsibilities typical for the public sector. I think this is ultimately what Brazil will need to do in order to unravel the mess, the fiscal mess that we've created. Instead of moving from a centralized model of government into a truly federalist system of government, something that should have happened after the 1988 Constitution, what we have actually done is to add new layers of government and new responsibilities for lower level government without truly decentralizing the authority to tax and the authority to spend and to really fulfill the expectations of society, paying enormous, exorbitant levels of taxation.
Would you guys add something to it, Sergio? Go ahead.
Well, I think the crisis is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it hurts a lot. It has enormous social costs. And in this respect, the worst is still to come. Since the shrinking of income and the rise in unemployment is at its early stages, I would say. But on the other hand, it creates the political possibilities to face and to overcome the structural problems that hinders the development of the country. If you look at the picture from, let's say, a static point of view, you would reach the conclusion that Brazil is doomed to failure because we are really in an insolvency trajectory and we are in the midst of an enormous leadership crisis with an extremely fragmented political system. But I tend to see things in a dynamic perspective. And I'm also of the half-full glass school. And my point here, one might argue that this is kind of wishful thinking, but I think there is good reasons to believe that the threat of insolvency itself is a trigger that will force political forces, corporate leaders, civil society leaders to reach a minimum denominator agenda to overcome the problems that the country is facing. And let me just finish this comment with a sort of, let's say, wild thought, maybe politically incorrect. But I think the difference between Brazil and Argentina is that Brazil flirts with the abyss, but we don't jump into it, right? There is enough instinct of
I knew it
survival.
was coming. So thank you very much. Can we let's go to the next question there.
Yes, Carlos Indacochea of the George Washington University. As a Peruvian, I have to dispute that World Cup of corruption. The Fujimori dictatorship is estimated to have cost Peru some 4 to 5 billion. 15 years later, the daughter of Fujimori is claiming 32 to 34% of support for the election. What I mean by this is that indignation, moral indignation, which is now flourishing in Brazil, can be a force for good only if it is applied politically and programmatically and systematically. Otherwise, it fizzles, because there was plenty of moral indignation with Fujimori and his accomplices 15 years ago.
I feel better already, but You wanted to say something to the last
No,
question, right?
just about, in terms of public opinion, I'm not sure the population overall knows that the party is over in terms of the fiscal issues. And if you see the 2013 protests, people were demanding more public services. And one thing that I believe, and we have a good proxy about the future of Brazil, that's the state of Rio Grande do Sul. Rio Grande do Sul is broken at the moment. And they are discussing in Rio Grande do Sul tough decisions. One of them is to have like a private pension for state employees. So by the time Brazil has to face tough decisions, I think the population will demand more transparency about which decisions they're going to make. And one of the things that the last election did badly for Brazil is that none of the candidates discussed the real issues. So the population is unaware that the party is over. So that's what I feel.
Okay, and Rio Grande do Sul is leading again.
May I just say something about the last question?
Yes.
I'll be very short. I just would like to say something. Well, dividing this crisis into two dimensions, economic and the corruption crisis, I would say that in terms of, I'm much more pessimistic in what regards to the economy than in what regards to corruption. I will say why. Because in the case of the economy, it seems that we haven't learned anything about what must be done. That is, we commit mistakes that should be avoided. And we didn't have exactly as one should expect economic policy regime established in Brazil. And this is why it was possible for the president to revert many important measures that were taken in Brazil since the Fernando Henrique Cardoso's years. In what regards corruption, I have a different perspective. I think that things are really getting better in Brazil. And they're really getting better because the institutions of control are working much better than in the past. That is, we have this scandal of corruption because the problems that used to be there for years, they are finally appearing. And they are finally appearing because the public ministry, the judicial branch, the federal police, the press, and the civil society are working much better than in the past. And even the internal controls of the executive branch work much better than in the past. And this is why we can tackle the problems of corruption nowadays much better than we used to do before.
Can I compliment Claudio's answer to this question on corruption?
Yes, let's try to be very brief on our comments now, because there are lots of questions here.
I'll be really brief. I completely agree with him that this is no one-time event. It's a reflection of the robustness of Brazilian institutions of control. And in conjunction with that, you have, on a sustainable basis, a stronger and stronger social demand for the rule of law. And I think this is really a revolution. Let me just exaggerate a little bit for the sake of strengthening the argument. This is really new, and I think this is a sustainable process in Brazil.
I agree with him.
Okay, question here, please, and then Sui. Just come here, and there. Yes. Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Identify yourself.
Carlos Aramayo, Director of the South America Group. I think it's great that all of you think that the institutions are working, and indeed they are working. They are prosecuting all this corruption. But in a sense, I hear, okay, so the next leadership, the next political leadership will have to tackle all these problems. Who is this next political leadership? They are, in a sense, already part of this institutional design that has carried Brazil to this point. And I heard, okay, we haven't jumped to the abysm, but you're right there already. Isn't that bad enough?
Okay, thank you. I will collect some questions here. Julia, come here to the front. We are going to go here, there, and then, yes. Oh, no, go, just hold on a second.
Actually, mine is correlated to this gentleman's, Gabriel Trebot with McClarty Associates. And perhaps for Mori Sumoda, considering your polling background, you know, if we were to play out the resignation or impeachment scenario, according to the Constitution, of course, Michel Temer would assume the presidency. But given the implication, or given how closely tied the PMDB is to this scandal, do you think that that would be a natural course so that the public would support that, or are we talking about a special elections scenario?
Okay, go ahead and then answer this question, then we come back here, there, and there.
It's interesting, if you poll Michel Temer today, it's around 25% of people that knows he is the vice president. So, so there's going to be a very uncertainty about how the public opinion is going to react on that. But one thing is for sure, people that know a little bit about the political scenario sees PMDB as part of the problem and part of the solution. So it's going to be a very uncertain scenario on his opinion polls.
Yeah, let's continue here.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Yue Jiang. I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center, and my question is about the impact of the current political crisis in Brazil on the local level politics. Because we know Brazil has the 3 levels of government, the federal, the state, and the municipal. So it's actually very complicated, you know, when the party relations are intertwined with the intergovernmental relations. So my question is, have you observed, you know, this kind of political crisis has been translated into the local level, and if so, how it affects local politics? Thanks.
And very interesting because we have municipal elections in October of next year. Margaret, Julia, come here, because we are going to collect a few questions.
Thank you.
Margaret.
Margaret Daly Hayes, an old friend of Paulo's from a long time ago and teaching at Georgetown now. My question goes really to Eduardo's comment on the collapse of the political system. And I would argue that in order to introduce reforms, the laws governing the political system, political party formation, elections, and so forth are going to have to be changed. Do the people sitting in the current Congress have any desire, or can they be mobilized by popular support to make those changes? I know that a law has been bandied about with political party change, but not moved.
Okay, let's go across the table, please.
Hi, Bernadette Buxbaum. I am an attorney in the District of Columbia, formerly for the Inter-American Development Bank, and I have a quick question. How likely it is that the finance minister is going to resign in the near future, and what would be the expected consequences from that resignation?
And one final here, Anita, and then I promise we'll organize this.
Anita Fiore, Inter-American Development Bank, and most importantly, Mauricio Moura's wife. I like a phrase, and I think I said this to Paulo before. No democratic system exists with absolute separation of power or with lack of separation of power. Don't you think we are too close to an absolute separation of powers?
Okay, and please remember the first question in terms of leadership, what's next? And one question to wrap this series of questions. President Cardoso was quoted as saying recently that in times like this in the past, we would be right now talking about names of generals. Now we are talking about names of judges, meaning, and we seem to all believe that democracy is not at all at risk in Brazil, that we are going to resolve this mess that we created in democracy. So, with that in mind, I would like you guys to address these questions that were posed here. Who goes first?
I can go first, and I would tackle the question on the leadership. And well, I mean, it's kind of easy to agree with this thesis of lack of leadership, because it's evident, it's true. But I would advise you not to be deterministic in this regard. And let me just mention a couple of historical examples that leaders that no one expected to rise up to the occasion, but they did, right? To start with, I would mention President Itamar Franco, Vice President of impeached President Fernando Collor, a kind of backward-looking, redneck kind of politician, nationalist.
Too much.
No, I mean, I'm saying this on my own. You don't. You have no responsibility for the things I'm saying here.
Okay.
And the other example is Eduardo Duarte in Argentina, and who played in a very important role in the transition from the 21-22 crisis to the first term of National Kirchner in government in a very, very constructive way. And he was a typical leader of the Urbano Bonaerense. And so, sometimes in politics, when you expect the unavoidable, something unexpected happens. And in terms of our supply of leadership, I would say that I'm maybe pessimistic, but not catastrophically pessimistic, because in spite of all their divisions, there are good politicians in the opposition. I can name José Serra, Geraldo Alckmin, Ivan Aécio, Marina, President Cardoso in a kind of special position. So please don't overstate the pessimism with regards to the ability of Brazil to supply leadership, especially when you consider, let's say, maybe even the US, right? We don't have no Donald Trump down here.
Let me add two names to that
Can you
list.
say something about this point also, Paulo?
Yeah, no, let me add two names to the list. The mayor of São Paulo, Fernando Haddad, and the mayor of Rio, Eduardo Paes. Those are actually in the younger side of things and are maybe potentially leaders rising. Go ahead, Claudio.
No, what I would say is that I see this problem of a lack of leadership in Brazil, especially in the Congress. It was common in Brazil a few years ago to make a division in the Congress that is somewhat similar to a division that's made in the US. The US used to talk about the backbenchers and the elite of the Congress. Here we used to call the backbenchers the lower clergy, in opposition to the higher clergy, in an ecclesiastical metaphor about the Congress. But it's interesting that in recent years, people don't talk about this division anymore. It seems that we have almost only lower clergy inside the Congress. And I don't think that this is an impressionistic problem. It has to do with problems of recruitment. And why this? Because the cost of electoral campaigns are so high that the kind of leaders, that the kind of candidates that are recruited by the parties to run for a seat in the Congress are of a different type that ran to the Congress a few years ago. And what kind of problem it creates? It creates problems in the kind of demands that the Congress poses to the president. And so I think that this is a real problem, much more than a problem of the eventual appearance of important leaders for the executive branch. And since I'm talking about the executive branch legislature relation, there is a question that was raised by her about the division of branch of government in Brazil. Well, I don't think that they are totally separate. What I think is that we have, as I mentioned before, a crisis of the political coalition. And since the partisan coalition, the governmental coalition, is what makes the relationship between the two branches of government work, when we have a crisis in that, we have also a crisis in the relationship between the two branches of government.
Okay, Eduardo, wanted to make any comment?
I was thinking to myself here, one of the advantages of having a certain age, and that's my case, is that I've seen Brazil in much worse shape. And I think we are perfectly capable of overcoming the current problems. I'm sure about this. And the problems we have are fundamentally two. we have to put the fiscal system of the country in shape, and we have to recreate political representation. And that brings me to the question about political reform. I think it's absolutely critical for Brazil to have a system of voting in which the electorate is much closer to those who they elect and who represent them. I think we will need a major reform in order to bridge this enormous distance that has arisen between the electorate on the one hand and those who supposedly represent them. And I think that the question I put to myself is this: how bad things will have to get in order for society and for the political leadership to rise to the occasion and to face the real problems that Brazil faces. But we are perfectly capable of solving the mess we are in. And in the long run, I'm very optimistic about Brazil. I think to some extent, this is a good crisis because it's the end of a cycle, and Brazil will begin a new cycle in much better shape once this is done. The really disquieting thing is that in the middle of a crisis, we don't know how far it will have to go before the turnaround. And this is why every crisis is the worst crisis, while it is happening. But once it's done, you see in retrospect that we had the resources and the energy to overcome the situation.
Thank you very much.
One thing. I'm sorry, about the local politics. That was a question about that specifically. Well, I think that what we have as an important economic and political effect of the current crisis on local politics has to do with the revenue of municipalities and states in Brazil. They are truly affected by this decreasing of the economic activity in Brazil in recent years, because they collect less taxes, because they have problems in terms of all the pressures that unemployed people do on the local governments. And I'm sure that it will have important political effects on the next municipal elections of 2016. And in addition to this, when we consider the performance of the main political parties in local elections in Brazil, in the last 3 elections, one of the 2 main parties that grew all the time was the PT. I'm sure, and this thing I can say with no doubt, that the PT will have an important decrease in their votes for the next municipal election. So perhaps you'll have this conservative wave that we had in the Congress last year, also at the municipal level for the next year.
Okay.
And and this is perfect. I fully agree with Professor Claudio. And just to add that, I think this time PT will also face like a huge economic, people feeling in the economic side, and they blame directly the PT. So it's going to be very hard for them in the next municipal election. As far as I know, PT is kind of divided as of today. If they tackle a more coalition strategy for next year and they start to support candidates from other parties, this is kind of a breakthrough for PT. It's one option. The second option would be to do old school PT, to put a position and have like their own candidate, even knowing that they're going to lose, like they used to do in the beginning of the 80s. So it's going to be a very hard election for them next year.
Okay, let me just, how about Bernadette's question on Levy? Is that relevant if he stays? If he goes, full disclosure, Joaquim Levy is a dear friend, has been here at the Wilson Center. I see him as a serious, dedicated public servant. Any difference if he stays now, if he leaves? Would that have any consequences?
Well, I think it would prove to be a tipping point, although, let's put it in economic jargon, the marginal returns of Joaquim Levy are clearly going down.
Okay. We have a question here. Carol, who has the mic here? Julia, could you give?
Hi, I'm Marjorie Macieira. I'm an independent consultant. I'd like to know, in terms of planning and preparing for the Olympics, what are going to be some implications with all of this going on? Also, where did all that money go?
On this side, let's go. Hold on, guys. Let's go here.
Sergio Lamucci with Valor Econômico. I'd like to ask especially Professor Eduardo Giannetti and also Mauricio if you're not underestimating the problems to make a fiscal adjustment in Brazil, because if you talk to a guy like Mansueto Almeida that knows a lot about fiscal accounts, he says that you have to do a combination of spending cuts and raising taxes, and there's a huge opposition to cut taxes, to cut spending and raise taxes from politicians and from the population. How do you work this out?
Okay, one final here.
Hi, I'm Shen. I'm a student at SAIS Johns Hopkins. I'm from Malaysia, and I can say that we look at Brazil with envy. We have our own political corruption scandal going on, maybe one of the biggest in history as well, and we definitely don't see the kind of institutional strength that you do in Brazil in Malaysia. So with that, I just had a quick question on the Bolsa Familia and other social programs. What do you see the implications of the twin crises on the sustainability of these programs? Is there some sort of opportunity for a greater discussion on long-term structural change instead of giving cash transfers, investing more in jobs and human capital development?
Okay, thank you. Guys, the floor is yours. Who will tackle? Bolsa Familia stays, is cut. What happens?
They go first. I'm eating now.
Yeah, let me say something.
Okay.
I think it's possible to do it. Fernando Henrique Cardoso has done it when there was the exchange rate crisis in 1999. He produced a major fiscal change with a primary surplus. Then Lula, when he got into power in 2003, produced as well a much higher primary surplus. I don't see why there isn't any scope now for a much more aggressive cut in expenditure in Brazil. The problem is that the president doesn't want to do it, really, for good. And she still seems to think that she can kind of mislead or pretend that she's doing something when in practice she's not doing much. And I think this will have to change. And this is probably the reason why Joaquim Levy is so frustrated about his presence in the ministry. Because I think he believed when he got there in the first place that he would have the support to do it. But it's clear now, 9 months after the beginning of this government, that he hasn't got the support and the willingness of the head of the executive to really produce the cuts that Brazil needs. In terms of fiscal revenues, I guess the most likely thing to happen once the current proposal doesn't get approved in Congress, the transaction on financial transactions, the tax on financial transactions falls, isn't approved. I think it's going to be a tax on fuels. Okay, this is something that doesn't depend on Congress voting, because it's something that the executive can do it on its own. And I think this is going to be where they're going to find revenues. It's very unpopular, but it's probably necessary if they want to reduce a minimum primary surplus next year.
Yeah, this is the CD you're talking about.
Yes.
Correct. Yes. Actually, this is a tax that could be good because it would give incentive for people to use more ethanol and less gasoline, and it would be, in terms of climate, a little bit better with what we had. A question on...
I think, Sergio, just to, again, I think what's happening right now in Rio Grande do Sul is a great proxy, because at the moment they are discussing very tough decisions in the statewide. And I think closer we get to make tougher decisions, more likely to have a fiscal adjustment.
Okay, there was also a question. The Olympics, please. Do you guys take a guess on what I read that some of the stuff, some of the installations are actually ahead of schedule, and that even the venues where the water sports, it's getting under control, and never underestimate the capacity of Brazilians to throw a party. So it's, do you guys have any indication on the Olympics? Is that something that will be a fiasco, or?
I mean, I have just, let's say, more or less educated guess on the subject, but as far as my knowledge goes, compared to the World Cup, I think the Olympics will be a big success, maybe to the benefit of the mayor of Rio de Janeiro. I think most of public works are on schedule. Some of them even will be delivered before the deadline established. So chances are that the Olympics will be a plus and not a minus on Brazil. Can I make a final comment on the fiscal challenges, or our time is?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Very, very briefly. The status quo, the fiscal regime as it is now, will sooner or later lead us to insolvency. There are only two options to tackle this problem. One is inflation, and the other is a structural fiscal adjustment. I think there is a big robust social rejection of higher inflation in Brazil. The Real plan in this respect has been really a milestone, a watershed in Brazil. And Brazil in this respect compares favorably with other neighboring countries such as Argentina, where there is much larger social tolerance in relation to inflation. So confronted with these two options, either higher inflation or fiscal adjustment, I think the politician will be forced in a way or another to follow the path of fiscal adjustment at the end of the day.
Okay, I don't resist the temptation adding an information here. Actually, this comes from something that Pedro Parente, who was the Secretary and Minister of Planning and Chief of Staff for President Cardoso for a while, a public servant, central bank, now retired in the private sector. He used to remind people that the Brazilian Congress, if there is a measure of leadership, if there is some effort to convince Congress, will approve anything and its opposite. And the mention here, the example here is in the President Collor's administration, the approval by Congress by a freezing of savings accounts in Brazil, which I think is the only thing I can imagine that would lead Americans to jump over the walls of the White House and invade. The accounts, your savings were frozen, and this was approved by Congress, which leads me to think that it's really a problem leadership to convince, to dialogue, and to convince Congress to face the situation and approve what needs to be approved. Now, let me go back here and
just
yes.
a clarification here. This is no longer possible in Brazil through an executive order to freeze financial assets, right?
Yeah.
Right. So don't be scared, guys.
Yeah, no, it's but the fact that once it was approved by Congress in Brazil, it's one of the most absurd pieces of proposals already.
It took a hyperinflation to create pressures for this.
Yeah, and let me add another point about that. If they reject that measure, there would happen a bank run. Mm-hmm. And so the Congress had to pass that bill, because if they didn't do that, they would have an economic collapse. And so even in a situation like this, it was a special case.
Okay, we have 3 more questions here. Will be the final questions. Ana Luisa, go ahead, please.
Ana Luisa with ISS. I would like to follow up on Sergio's question with Professor Gianetti. You mentioned fiscal reforms that both Lula and Fernando Henrique did, which I agree they were also very, very strong, but how does the lack of support that Dilma has today, both in Congress and among the population, would make this harder? I feel like it's not exactly a fair comparison.
Okay, question, please.
Bob Hoff, retired Foreign Service officer. What's happening with the
No, go ahead.
What's happening with investment in infrastructure, especially railways, ports, highways, investments which were part of this PACI, the Program of Accelerated Development, and especially now that a number of the presidents of engineering firms and construction firms have been caught up in Lava Jato and are in jail?
Okay, final question.
Exactly, this is the same question. Peter Vogert, formerly Brazilian World Bank and with the IMF too, and now with the Institute of Global Studies in Germany. We are back to the first question. Maybe it is good to end because it was obviously only the number 2 issue, the economics of it all. I mean, wonderful fiscal reforms, great, as you know, to get the fiscal house in order, but where is the growth coming from to generate this? If we have problems with public infrastructure and private business being half in jail and half out, where's the confidence coming from that investments, private investments, will indeed, as you know, come in the next 5 to 10 years?
And I will complement this. Do you see any scenario where that situation leads to social unrest?
All right. Now, Eduardo Giannetti will answer in a nutshell all the questions related to the fiscal disarray and how to overcome it.
Oh, thank you. I don't see any likelihood that the current Dilma Rousseff government will do structural fiscal reform. I think this is out of question. What she can do, and she's trying to do apparently, is to make emergency measures not to let the worsening of the situation produce other rounds of downgrade for Brazil. But the struggle for this government is to produce short-term results. I don't think they're going to have any condition or any initiative to produce major structural reform. As far as investment is concerned, Brazil is presently at a low-time low. It's the lowest level of investment in many, many years. Infrastructure has suffered, in particular because of all the problems with the companies involved in the corruption scandal. And the government is trying to attract private investment, rounds of concessions for the private sector, but there is a paralysis. And this is why we are facing a really low level of investment in Brazil. Where will growth come from when it comes back? I think 2 sectors are poised to grow in Brazil. One is exports. We have a much more competitive exchange rate now, and I think we have a lot still to gain in terms of increasing our world exports. Brazil exports less than 1% of world exports. We are much behind our scope, our potential in world markets. In some sectors, I think, especially commodities, Brazil still has a lot to offer, and the world demand that. And the other sector that will lead growth, it's going to be investment in infrastructure. I think there's a major need, fundamental need for Brazil to improve not only transport, but sewage and housing and all the things that involve long-term capital investment. These are the 2 sectors that Brazil will need really for getting growth back on track.
Okay, who goes next?
Well, maybe the question on social. Let me just go back a little bit on the question on infrastructure. I think there is a silver lining potentially here because clearly there's a huge bottleneck in the infrastructure sectors. Nowadays, conditions are not ripe for big boost in terms of investment. But if we are able to, let's say, open up new horizons for Brazil, this may prove to be a very strong leverage in terms of resuming and igniting growth in Brazil. But on the question of social unrest, clearly I wouldn't rule this out, given the fact that the worst is still to come in terms of loss of income and unemployment. But the important thing here is to understand the political effect of social unrest in Brazil. And again, I think it's interesting to compare Brazil and Argentina. I'm kind of obsessed about comparing Brazil and Argentina because
it could be Venezuela.
No, because when paradoxically I love Argentina, and it's the country that I know best after Brazil. But one has to take into consideration that one thing is a situation in which 30% of the voters are concentrated in the same geographical space as in the conurbano bonaerense, which that means that social unrest has a much stronger immediate political effect than in a country like Brazil, where centers of power are much more decentralized in the country and in the geographical and political space.
Okay, and in defense of Argentina, they have better soccer, better meat, and better wine than Brazil. So, Claudio.
Better soccer for the
Soccer, I
time
don't
being.
agree.
Yeah, for the time being. It's only temporary.
Well, I would say something about Bolsa Familia. That's a question that I think that's important. Well, it's clear for this government, I believe that it's clear even for the Congress, depending on what the Congress will really pass in terms of the bills, that Bolsa Familia is the one policy that must be preserved. Even because it's a safe net for the population, considering many other problems that can happen because of the decreasing of the economic activity. And so I think that this is not a policy that is on risk because of the fiscal adjustment. But the point is, if you have a pressure on Bolsa Familia, because you can have an increase of poverty in the next years in Brazil, caused by the decrease of economic activity. And this is a different issue. It's very difficult, I think, to figure out right now what would be the consequence of this. I don't think that we have a huge transformation of the number of families that depend, that rely on Bolsa Familia compared to what we have nowadays. But the point is, this is a state policy. It came to stay and probably to be preserved in next years.
Well, Mauricio, any observation? Okay, with that, I'll just have a little bit of promotion here of the Institute. We have great staff, Michael Darden, the program associate, the program assistant, Ana Carolina Cárdenas, who were very helpful in setting this up. Our interns, Julia Cardoso, a student at George Washington University from Brasilia, and Thalita Franco from American University, came from Campinas in São Paulo, and Thalita did a wonderful thing for us, which is an infographic on the Brazilian judiciary, guide to the judiciary process in Brazil in the beautiful colors of the Brazilian flag. We are going to post this, and you should take a look because you better understand how the judiciary works in Brazil. We are going to use it a lot in the next few years. With that, I would like to thank Sergio Fausto very much for hosting this at the Fernando Henrique Cardoso Institute. Also, Claudio Couto and Eduardo Janete da Fonseca. Thank you guys very, very much for this. It's been a very interesting, enlightening discussion. To my dear friend, Mauricio Moura here from Idea Inteligência, an up-and-coming polling research firm. And to all of you who have followed us in this procedure, stay tuned. We will keep following this crisis and trying to keep you informed about Brazil. Thank you very much. Good day.
So much, guys.